I'll send out a link for you to purchase the recording at a later date and time. The recording has started, and I wanted to thank everybody for joining the 5th webinar, I believe, of 2014, entitled Mills Act Learning by Example. We encourage you to become a member of CPF and enjoy the benefits and educational discounts. And information on membership can be found on our website at californiapreservation.org. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure protection of historic resources in California. The format for today's webinar will consist of a session of presentation, 8 or 9 presentations by various speakers from across the state. All of the sessions will be followed by a 15-minute question and answer period. You may be polled for your opinion at appropriate times. In fact, in this presentation, we're going to have a total of 4 polls. The poll box will briefly take up a large portion of your screen, but it will disappear when the poll is complete. There is a Q&A box on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box and we will hold the question until it can be addressed by a speaker. There is also a chat box which is visible to all participants. If you would like to comment or interject, you may do so directly through the chat box. The chat box is right above the Q&A box. If you are attached to a microphone, you should grant Adobe Connect voice access to your microphone when asked to do so. Your voice will be muted during most of the presentation, but you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol at the top of your screen. Each of you should see a hand symbol on the, it would be the far right icon in the middle top portion of your screen. If you just click on that hand symbol, that alerts me and lets me know that you'd like to ask a question, at which time I will probably unmute your phone line or your voice, and you could either ask it using your own personal voice or you can do it through the chat box. Once you're done with your question, we will resume muting your voice, and if you ever have a question, you may raise your hand again. Speakers will discuss the Mills Act in the following order. Robert Chattel will begin as moderator. Robert is the president of Chattel Incorporated Historic Preservation Consultants. Mike Bueller will follow up. Mike is the executive director of San Francisco Heritage. Lambert Giesinger, the historic preservation architect for the city of Los Angeles, will follow. Susan Parks from the city and county of San Francisco is a preservation planner with the city and county. Marissa Mosier, associate at Chattel Incorporated and also a contract preservation planner. John Chiampa, associate planner for the city of San Clemente. And then followed by Carol Limline, the president of the Santa Monica Conservancy. Patricia Johnson-Connor will be speaking from the perspective of a real estate appraiser. She's the Mills Act specialist and real estate appraiser for the city, for the county of Los Angeles, for the assessor's office. And finally, Shannon Lochner, the historian at the local government unit of the California Office of Historic Preservation. Without further ado, I will get started right away right here, and we will begin the presentation by turning it over to Robert Chattel.
Thank you, John. I wanted to welcome all of the participants and especially the speakers. This is truly a unique opportunity for us to have a roundtable and discuss the various aspects across the state of how we work with the Mills Act program. Just a little bit of background. The Mills Act contracts that we have in about 86 cities and counties in the state is a program of potential property tax reduction. It was first enacted in 1972. There were changes over time and pretty specifically in 2012 that we'll review with the speakers. I think as the program evolves over time, there's been a lot of concern about the loss of revenue to cities, what is reviewed in terms of contracts and so forth. And with our 9 participants representing large and small cities and advocacy groups, as well as the at least the County of Los Angeles assessor, will look at some examples of those programs. And we hope to hear from the Office of Historic Preservation, Shannon Lochner, who's also on the phone. So I think that this is just a unique opportunity for people to participate. Among the things that we want to review, somewhat in this order, again, revigorating underutilized programs since the Mills Act legislation has been around for decades. There's been renewed interest in how the programs are promoted in each city and whether they're welcome, not welcomed, and how important they are. It's clearly one of the most important preservation tools in California. Some of you may know that the California Preservation Foundation is sponsoring a program to enact a state historic tax credit, which would be the next most creative program for California to have in terms of incentives for historic preservation. And a bill has been entered by Assemblymember Tony Atkins from San Diego. I should note that the Mills Act was named for James Mills, who was a legislator from San Diego as well. So there's a rich history of San Diego's role in statewide programs in preservation. The issues that we want to discuss include whether interior is included in reviews and protections under the Mills Act. Many cities explicitly exclude interior reviews. Some cities review structural work, but not mechanical, electrical, and plumbing work. We wanted to discuss non-historic additions, and I think we have some good examples. I think among our interests is in finding out how the assessor looks at additions when they're doing their revaluations. The caps on benefits to individual properties and to loss of incomes to cities and counties is a very hot topic. We've been looking to see if there's a city, and it may be Berkeley, we first thought it was San Clemente, that may have had a predetermined notice of non-renewal date, essentially creating a revolving fund, and we're curious to know if anyone has more information about that. I think as we move forward and as the state mandates for both pre-approval and inspections at least every 5 years, we think there probably needs to be more training for cities and counties and assessors staff as the program expands over time and as it's scrutinized over time. So we hope to review all of these topics today with our group. And again, this is the list of the people who are participating. I just wanted to note that Lambert and Susan are taking the perspective of larger cities, Marissa and John of smaller cities, Mike Bueller and Carol Lemline from the point of advocacy, and Patricia from the LA County Assessor on reassessment, and Shannon Lochner from OHP on the role of OHP, which I think would be helpful for us to understand today in the light of the changes from 2012.
Okay, this is John. I just wanted to mention I brought up a poll, and it looks like people are answering it right now. It looks like most people in the room already have a Mills Act program in place, which is the audience we were aiming for. So I'm sure there will be a lot of questions later. I'm going to pull up a second poll, Robert, if you don't mind, and this poll will ask about, I believe it's reviews. 1 second here. Inspections. So from the people who've answered, it looks like most people don't, currently have a regular inspection process in place, and I'm guessing, Robert, you were going to speak to that.
I think it's helpful to know that. I think that we're all struggling with the changes from 2012 that, for those of you who may not know, require that the city or county that holds the contract perform an inspection of the property to ensure that the work that was proposed is being carried out. This was an issue apparently in San Diego when Assemblymember Wiese proposed the legislation. There was an opportunity that CPF stepped in and advocated for making sure that it was the city and counties that are responsible for the contracts to do the inspections. For a while it was almost the assessor or even OHP that was going to be assigned the role of doing the inspection. So with CPF's assistance, Wieso's staff actually changed the proposed legislation, so I think it's strong and appropriate. And maybe that's something, Lambert, when you speak, you could address how you think to perform those 5-year inspections for the city of Los Angeles. But moving on to Mike.
Okay.
Yes, hello everyone. Good afternoon. This is Mike Bueller, San Francisco Heritage, and I'm just going to speak for a few minutes on on the advocacy organization's role in revitalizing moribund Act programs, and maybe some of you have that situation in your own city. I'll just share developments in San Francisco over the last 3.5 years since I've been executive director here at San Francisco Heritage, starting in fall 2010. The city of San Francisco has had a Mills Act program on the books for decades. However, over that time, it had become notoriously difficult for property owners to qualify for property tax abatement under the program. In the first 3 decades or so of the program, only 5 Mills Act contracts had actually been approved by the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco, meaning that it had really become an illusory preservation incentive, and not an incentive that we as an advocacy organization could hold out to property owners and members of the community as a real benefit of owning a historic property. Just to provide a little bit of context here in San Francisco, in 2009, city voters approved a measure called Prop J, which called for amendments to the city's preservation ordinance to make preservation protection stronger. That ballot measure resulted in a complete overhaul of the city's preservation ordinances that also invited intense scrutiny among elected officials as to existing preservation protections and what would be appropriate in terms of amendments and strengthening of the existing protections. So that was the kind of environment that I came into in 2010, 2011 as the Planning Department and the Historic Preservation Commission, the newly created Historic Preservation Commission, were grappling with how to implement Prop J. Within that environment, there was a new historic district proposed in DuBose Park, one of a handful of new districts that had been in development for some time. In this first slide, I have a copy of an article that appeared in the New York Times in late 2011, talking about backlash among residents in DuBose Park against efforts to create a landmark district of their neighborhood. There was no doubt that their neighborhood is eligible for landmark designation. It has high integrity and uniformity among the buildings within the neighborhood. However, repeatedly residents would complain of fears of overregulation, and also they would complain that the benefits are not really available to them, which led to this article in the New York Times. Our response in a guest opinion appeared the few days later, and I just have an excerpt from our guest opinion, which is an important tool for an advocacy organization to use, of course, where at the time I talked about the need for the city, as it is designating historic districts such as this, to provide real benefits to property owners. And this is one of kind of many opportunities where San Francisco Heritage called for the city to amend its Mills Act program to make it more accessible to property owners. I'll go to the next slide here. Just a few other examples of how San Francisco Heritage really focused attention on the need to reform the city's Mills Act program, going back to an issue of Heritage News, our newsletter, back from 2011. In our priorities for reform there, you might not be able to see it on your screen, but the first priority was to increase access to preservation incentives. We love to use examples like Los Angeles and San Diego to show how behind the curve San Francisco has been in approving Mills Act contracts. A statistic that we repeatedly pointed out is how San Francisco only had 5 contracts, whereas its Southern California peers have hundreds, often several hundreds, or even over 1,000 contracts in place. Remember how many actually have been approved in Los Angeles to date. Another recent example, Heritage collaborated with a local planning think tank organization, SPUR, which many of you might be familiar with. Not widely considered a preservation organization, although preservation has been a topic that they focus on from time to time. We partnered with SPUR in a process that took over 2 years, developed a joint policy paper giving kind of an assessment of historic preservation in San Francisco and making a series of recommendations for how historic preservation program under the planning department can be improved. One of the recommendations, number 10, you can see there, was to expand local access to Mills Act property tax relief. Just another example of how we've advocated for that. Going back to the first slide real quick, because it is important to note the importance of the role of the Dubois Park Landmark District nomination in bringing about changes to the local Mills Act program. Supervisor Scott Wiener is the supervisor for this part of the city where Dubois Park is located. He had, at the time, he had been leading, he had called special hearings on historic preservation, scrutinizing the role of historic preservation, calling for certain reforms that would streamline how preservation protections are administered. Through the proposed landmark district, which he steadfastly supported, even though he's not considered a pro-preservation supervisor generally. He reached out to Heritage as well as the planning department to draft legislation that would implement reforms based on best practices in other cities to make, primarily Los Angeles, to make the Mills Act program here more accessible. Really, the planning department, and Susan will share the department's perspective later on, deserves tremendous credit in terms of working with the supervisor's office in identifying kind of common sense improvements like an application deadline and a uniform form for filling it out. And these were some of the elements that were incorporated into the ordinance that amended the city's program. And that passed in 2012. And my last slide is a copy of an article from our current newsletter talking about the Board of Supervisors' approval of 10 contracts at the end of 2013 to basically triple the number of Mills Act contracts we have in San Francisco, and Susan was the key planning department staff person who worked on those contracts, and we'll hear about that later. So, we repeatedly publicized the need for reform, and of course, once the contracts are actually making their way through the process, we definitely wanted to publicize the fact that the program is working as intended. And some of the other things that we have done to help encourage more Mills Act applications in San Francisco. For individual properties that have applied for Mills Act, we frequently have testified or written letters of support, encouraging the supervisor for their district to support the Mills Act application. When the amendments to the Mills Act program were being drafted, we pointed out best practices in other cities that could be instructive and should be incorporated into the city's program. And just general kind of hand-holding and providing some initial technical support to property owners wondering how the process works. I will say that the planning department has devoted significantly more resources to the Mills Act program in San Francisco, and a lot more technical assistance is currently available than it perhaps was in the past. So that's about it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I'll jump in now. Lambert Giesinger with the City of Los Angeles. Was asked to focus a little bit in terms of how our program addresses lost revenue to the city, as well as how we look at properties that are over our valuation exemptions under the program. So just to give a brief recap on our program, if I can advance the slide. So currently the City of Los Angeles has 716 contracts in our program, and that's for the years of the first year of contracts 1997 to last year 2013. Approximately 75% of our contracts are single-family residential dwellings, most of which are in our historic preservation overlay zones. And our City Council has agreed to lose up to $2 million of lost revenue. That was recently increased from $1 million, and that's looking at the total program. And it's important when that number is sort of looked at, it is relative to what our city collects per the county in terms of general levy tax, 1%. Our amount is slightly under 11% of the 1% general levy tax that's collected. So in the scheme of things for a relatively large city, that's a fairly small number. So there hasn't been a lot of angst in terms of the lost revenue. And our program, the planning department is where the program resides. We are responsible for calculating the lost revenue annually, and that is looked at through a combination of forms that we receive from the county assessor's office, and it's input into a program that tracks each property. So we're able to look at the specific numbers for each property as well as the total amount for the city, which is currently at $978,956. So just a quick kind of summary in terms of how the city looked at lost revenue when the program was first being kind of developed back in the mid-1990s. The city was looking at a limit of valuation for all properties of $500,000 and a total loss of revenue for the city of $500,000. In further amendments to what was finally adopted by Council for the Mills Act, we exempted downtown historic core properties, which are roughly the downtown area bounded by the major freeways, and those properties essentially to spur more use of the Mills Act in that area, they were lifted from the exempt amount. And then for multifamily commercial and industrial properties, the limit was set to $1.5 million for other areas. And in 1999, the downtown historic core area was increased to include the Figueroa corridor, which is kind of going south of downtown almost to USC. And the revenue loss to the city for the total program was increased to $1 million. And then in 2001, again, to kind of encourage the use of the Mills Act outside of the downtown area, the Hollywood Historic Core was included for properties that would be exempt from the valuation limit. And then also, as the economy was sort of increasing in terms of property values, we increased the limit for single-family residential to $1.5 million, and commercial properties, again, outside of the exempt areas, to $3 million. And most recently, in 2011, we had an increase in the lost revenue cap from $1 million to $2 million, and that was as the result of the cap getting quite close. We were about 910,000 when we requested the increase, again, to increase capacity in the program. And then in terms of properties that are over the valuation limit of the 1.5 for single family and 3 million for commercial properties, there are specific criteria that our Cultural Heritage Commission uses to review those exemptions. Those are that a property is an exceptionally significant historic cultural monument or historic preservation overlay zone contributing property. Also, that the property has excessive and or unusual maintenance requirements or is in otherwise danger of demolition. We have to find that the revenue loss will not exceed now the $2 million for the program for all contracts. And what we do now, which is also a kind of further refinement of the meeting the exemption criteria, is that the preparation and use of an historic structure report needs to be done in terms of guiding the rehabilitation work and substantiating the need for the exemption. We also look at priority consideration criteria, of which there are these 5 that generally a property has to meet at least 3 out of the 5 in order to qualify for the Mills Act. So this is for all applications, and they are further scrutinized for properties that require an exemption. But the biggest one is probably necessity, and that is, what does the property need to ensure its preservation, and what is required both in terms of the amount of work and also, looking at the owner's commitment to how that work is done. Uniqueness, to ensure that the property, which in most cases a property that is a contributor to a historic district as well as historic cultural monument, they're kind of by their nature unique. Investment looks at the owner's commitment to investing in the property. So we usually look at, what is the kind of total investment required to rehabilitate the property, understanding that the owner's commitment to that may be much greater than the tax savings, so that we're getting a lot more preservation than just what the Mills Act is covering. And then for certain projects, mainly commercial or industrial, we might look at an affordability aspect in terms of providing affordable housing or employment, to low and moderate income persons. And so properties with valuations greater than the threshold must meet the exemption criteria and 3 out of the 5 priority consideration criteria. And as I mentioned, the use of an historic structure report per Preservation Brief 43 is important to basically kind of create a level playing field so that everyone is submitting a document that is, formatted in the same manner relative to justifying the need for the exemption. And those exemption cases are heard by our Cultural Heritage Commission with an up or down vote as to whether or not they accept the argument. And then Robert mentioned to discuss a little bit about how we plan to approach the now state-mandated quinquennial inspections for the Mills Act. And we certainly, when we had sort of full staffing in our office, we had a person who did inspections regularly. I think the old language said periodically, which we kind of took to mean every 3 years. With the state mandate now of every 5 years and the loss of staff in our office, we basically haven't been doing inspections. It's really set up on a kind of honor system that owners will do the right thing, and they will inform our office when they make changes. When we have contact with applicants, we often ask them to kind of self-report what they've done, where they're at with the contract, and that's worked fairly well. There's probably, out of our contracts, we'll say, a dozen bad apples that probably need to be brought to task. But one thing we're looking at now, in addition to kind of general fund asks to get monies to use an on-call consultant to outsource the inspections, we're also looking at exploring an ordinance change to basically collect fees from both existing contract holders and prospective applicants to basically charge an annual maintenance fee to again, use an outside consultant to do the inspections for us. So that's kind of a direction we're going in. Unfortunately, we don't have in our current fee structure that as a separate line item, and so we're not allowed to collect fees kind of generally and use excess money for inspections. We have to actually charge a fee specifically for the task at hand. So that's just in a nutshell kind of the direction we're headed in as a fairly large city with a good number of contracts to basically have the property owners pay for that as well. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Lambert, if you would, just as a transition to Susan, could you address the interior versus exterior review?
Oh, that's good. Well, historically, in terms of Los Angeles, our approach to Mills Act always kind of dovetailed nicely with our historic designation process from 1962, where the expectation was that unless excluded, designations of properties automatically included interiors, exteriors, grounds, really the kind of totality of the property and its character-defining features. So our Mills Act approach has always looked at interiors, and in cases where the historic preservation overlay zones specifically do not look at interiors, that's kind of an additional requirement for properties that are in the Mills Act that are contributors to historic districts, that additional review is required. But that's a review that we always had on our designated historic cultural monuments. So it was really nothing new, and certainly now dovetails with what I think the recent amendments by Assemblyman Wesso have specifically called out, that interiors and exteriors must be inspected. So I know it's always been part of the tax code, the way the Mills Act is looked at from a tax perspective, that you have to look at the property in its entirety. So I guess we think that that we've always just kind of done that as a matter of course to protect all historic aspects of the property.
Thank you. And let's move on to Susan Parks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Parks with the San Francisco Planning Department. Last year, San Francisco tripled its number of Mills Act contracts. Like Mike mentioned, we went from 5 contracts to 16 contracts. He also touched briefly on some of the changes that allowed us to do that, and I'll go into a little bit more detail as to what those changes were. To be eligible for the Mills Act contract in San Francisco, the property has to be a designated historic resource. For us, that includes properties that are listed individually or as a contributor to a National Register district, or those that are designated under one of 2 parts of our planning code, either under Article 10 or Article 11, as individually significant as a landmark or a landmark district, or as a contributor or individually significant to a conservation district. We also require that properties be valued under $3 million for residential properties and under $5 million for commercial properties. If the property exceeds these thresholds, we require an HSR to demonstrate that the property is significant and is in need of extensive renovations that would otherwise not be feasible without the Mills Act. So a little bit of background information about our program. So the Mills Act was enacted in the city of San Francisco in 1996. Between 1996 and 2012, we issued 5 contracts. As Mike mentioned, the process was pretty difficult. There was no established timeline, and applications were submitted randomly throughout the year. Some contracts took over a year to go through the process, and excessive fees were charged along the way. In 2012, Supervisor Scott Wiener initiated a number of legislative changes that refined the city's process and reduced the fees to encourage more single-family property owners to apply for the Mills Act. So what exactly changed? As part of those legislative changes, an application deadline of May 1st was established. So now the department only accepts applications until May 1st of each year. The application established review periods, including 30-day review period for planning, followed by a 90-day review period for our assessor's office, and a full approvals process throughout the fall to ensure that all of our contracts are recorded by December 31st of each year. This means that if a property owner submitted their application in May of 2013 and everything went according to the timeline and was submitted correctly, that they could see a tax savings in October of 2014. So the application fees before 2012 were approximately $9,000 for residential properties and approximately $18,000 for commercial properties. The legislative changes reduced those fees to $2,500 and $5,000. And the city's $1 million cap on property tax savings was eliminated during this time. The Board of Supervisors does require that the Planning Department submit a Mills Act program status report, which includes finances of the program every 3 years. And with each application that goes before the board, as part of the Board of Supervisors hearing packets, we report not only the subject property's tax savings, but the overall impact of the program to the city's tax revenue. So in 2013, after all of those changes were passed, we had one application that was pending during the legislative changes, and at our May 1st deadline, 4 applications were submitted to the Planning Department. And also in May is when the DuBose Park Landmark District that Mike mentioned was passed by the Board of Supervisors. So in order to encourage property owners in the district to apply, the Planning Department conducted a Mills Act clinic where we outlined some of the recent changes, including the reduced fees, and we walked property owners through the goals of the program, the application process, talked a little bit about scopes of work, and the valuation process. We also made ourselves available to property owners and had multiple one-on-one meetings just to ensure that each property owner was comfortable with the process and with entering into a contract with the city before they submitted their application. In the end, we received 7 contracts from DuBose Park at a special September 3rd deadline, and 6 of those were approved by the Board of Supervisors at the end of the year. So some of the scopes of work that we accept for our rehabilitation plans, we define acceptable scopes of work as those that prolong the life of the building and those that help to restore the architectural integrity and improve the public realm. So for us, this is primarily exterior focused, includes exterior repairs and restoration, drainage issues, structural improvements, and interior repairs only if the interior has been designated as part of the landmark ordinance, usually under Article 10 of our planning code. Other interior spaces, such as new kitchens and baths, are not considered as part of the Mills Act at this time. We don't consider MEP or new additions, and all work to the property is required to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards. So I think we have a poll.
Susan, this is Robert. Can you address the role of the assessor? I think the City and County of San Francisco is unique in that the assessor is another department.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go through that on the next slide and talk a little bit about our interagency process. If I can remove the poll. Oh, okay. Just 1 second. So we recently revised our process based on some of the lessons learned from last year. We do work very closely with our assessor's office, and just last year was a big learning curve for all of us, and so we've gone back this year and we've tried to establish some interagency deadlines aside from those more public legislative deadlines that have been established. We recently worked with them to create a flow chart, which you can see to the right. It's a little bit blurry, but I'll take you through some of the highlights of that. We currently provide, for the 2014 year, we're providing a sample valuation in our application packet. Previously, we provided a worksheet, but we found that it caused a lot of problems between both departments, and it elevated owners' expectations of what their tax savings would be. So we removed that. We provide them with a sample packet or sample valuation, which hopefully allows them to understand and somewhat predict what their tax savings will be before they apply. The planning department receives the applications on the May 1st deadline of each year, and then on June 1st, we transmit them to the assessor's office, who has 90 days to create the valuations. As part of our new process changes, we're instituting a 2-week review period for homeowners to review the valuations, and if they choose to accept the valuation, then they can move forward into the approvals process where the application is, you can see that here, where the application is reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission, Budget and Finance Committee, and the full Board of Supervisors. Like I said, we worked very closely with the assessor's office the last few months to refine the process. We've had a lot of growing pains, and we just want to thank them for tolerating it. And I know they're on the line today, and they've been very patient with us throughout the whole process. So that's my presentation. If you have any other questions about our process, I'm happy to answer.
I think in the interest of time, we should keep moving, and then we'll certainly take some more questions as we move forward. Marissa?
Yeah, so I'm Marissa Mosier. I'm working as a contract historic preservation planner for the City of Orange. So Robert and John asked me to speak a bit about the scope of a Mills Act program in a smaller city. For those of you who aren't familiar with Orange, it's in Orange County, a population of approximately 136,000, 25 square miles in area. The Mills Act program in Orange was enabled in 1998, and the eligibility requirements for the program are that the property be either a contributor to the city's historic districts or separately listed or eligible for the National Register or the California Register. Orange has 3 existing historic districts. All of them overlap each other. 2 of them are listed in the National Register, and 1 is a local district with slightly larger boundaries. The National Register listed district is actually the largest in California, and primarily single-family residences. Orange is in a bit of a unique situation because the city doesn't have a separate historic preservation commission and no process for designating individual resources, but it has a very strong tradition of historic preservation in the Old Town Historic District. particularly through a very active local advocacy group called the Old Town Preservation Association, and through the city's policies like design guidelines for the historic districts. And I think particularly because the historic districts are primarily single-family residences, the Mills Act program has been very successful in Orange. So there are about 1,300 eligible properties. Sorry, I should advance my slides. There are about 1,300 eligible properties in the city. Contracts are approved once yearly by the City Council. In 2009, the City Council placed a cap of 10 new contracts approved per year. There previously was a cap of 20 contracts. And in my experience, the number of applicants that we receive each year actually turns out to be about 10, kind of naturally. So this cap has not been overly restrictive in preventing people from receiving Mills Act contracts. So there are 200 active contracts in the city currently, which works out to be about 15% of the eligible properties in the city. We approved 9 new contracts last year, and the majority of the new contracts are actually with new property owners. Real estate agents in Orange are actually relatively familiar with the program and are offering it as a potential incentive to new property owners. The scope of work for Mills Act contracts in Orange is limited to exterior improvements and what we call critical systems of the building, so seismic retrofit and MEP, but not other interior-related work. And to ensure a substantial rehabilitation as part of the Mills Act contract, the city asks that applicants propose a rehabilitation plan where the cost of the improvements meet or exceed the total property tax savings over the first 10-year term of the contract. So that requires staff to figure out what the approximate property tax savings might be for a property owner in advance, which can be a challenge. The historic districts in Orange have relatively modestly sized houses, and Chapman University is located in the historic district, so there's quite a bit of demand for rental housing for students. So property owners in the historic district are frequently looking to build secondary housing units at the rear of historic properties. So it's been a challenge to staff to, first of all, determine what's compatible with the historic district, and then to determine also what the appropriate Mills Act assessment value is of the property with this associated new construction. So I'm particularly interested in hearing from Patricia Johnson-Connor about assessments, and it was helpful to hear from Susan as well about working with the assessor. The city currently has a reporting procedure where property owners are required to submit an annual report on compliance with their rehabilitation plan, and we're in the process of developing a series of phased inspections over 5 years. So with about 200 active contracts, we're looking at doing phased inspections of about 40 properties per year, which we anticipate will take about 2 weeks of staff time yearly, which is not a small amount of staff time for a city of the size of Orange. And we're also looking at expanding the Mills Act program. The city has 3 tracts of Eichler houses, mid-century housing tracts, which have been surveyed and determined eligible for designation as local historic districts. And once those districts move through the process, that will add another approximately 300 potentially eligible properties for the Mills Act. I'm going to turn it over to John.
Yeah.
John, hi.
Hi, Marissa. This is John. I'm bringing up a question from Steve Gerhardt, and he's asking what happens if an owner doesn't submit. Yeah, he was asking what happens if an owner doesn't submit their annual report.
We send a nicely worded letter that says, please submit your report you appear to have forgotten. We have not ever had a problem, at least to my knowledge, with people not submitting their annual reports.
So let's move on to John in the city of San Clemente.
Hello, my name is John. I manage the Mills Act for the city of San Clemente. The city of San Clemente has 210 historic properties. It established the Mills Act in 1997, which seems to be a common year with the cities on the panel. And we have 70 historic properties in the Mills Act. The city has a cap of 12 Mills Act contracts for each year. It allows a maximum of 4 applications per quarter for the first 3 quarters. This is because just to help with staff time, and then also there is usually a large push at towards the end of the year to get contracts recorded before the end of the year. So that's one of the reasons with the cap of 4. All of the historic properties are eligible, and depending on the condition of the historic property, there may be more or less rehabilitation improvements that will be tied to the agreement. Typical improvements for San Clemente are exterior. The City Council has directed that it will be only exterior improvements. No mechanical, structural improvements would be tied to any of these contracts unless desired by the property owner. Examples of improvements have on these photos here, garage doors, railings, deteriorated fountains, and conduit on the exterior of the property. As part of our process, we coordinate with the county assessor to estimate the potential property tax savings for the property with the first year to give the property owners an idea of what are their estimated savings. We have had a couple of historic property owners that have decided not to enter the Mills Act because they've owned the property for a number of years and the savings just doesn't make sense for them to enter into the agreement. In terms of how the city manages our Mills Act in working with the 70 properties, we've developed a spreadsheet that's color-coded so that it can be updated annually to give a quick reference of which properties have completed all their required restoration improvements, which are not in compliance or are in the process of completing those improvements or due for the upcoming year. Each property has its own tab that focuses in on what the improvements are required for that property and what are the identified years that they should be completed. This helps us follow along in terms of how the properties come along and add additional notes, see how if follow-up inspections are required, and also updating contact information for the property owners. As part of our management, we send out an annual letter to the property owners with this kind of readout of this slide showing what they need to do, letting them know that what improvements are coming down in the pipeline in the next couple of years, and then also reminding them that the planning department is required to review all exterior improvements, sending us any of their updated contact information, and just continuing a dialogue with the property owners. So that concludes my portion of the presentation.
Thank you, John. Let's move on to Carol Lemline with the Santa Monica Conservancy.
Thank you. I'm focusing my presentation on a challenge that has come up in the city of Santa Monica in terms of whether we need limitations on the number and value of Mills Act contracts. And the photos on this slide show examples of properties currently under contract. There are just fewer than 60 of them, a very small number of commercial buildings, and mostly single-family properties. So to give you some background on what happened, The Landmark Commission in Santa Monica initiated some work on improvements to the Mills Act application and implementation process. This had been going on for some time, but was escalated by what they considered a particularly egregious application that was made with very little, without what they considered to be the appropriate documentation. But they realized that the process as defined did not really describe what was expected. And so the kinds of improvements they were looking for in our process included making sure that there was strict adherence to city codes, not only in preservation-related issues, but in all issues, that there should be no outstanding code violations, that they follow the Certificate of Appropriateness process, which is how our commission controls change in landmark properties, and that, of course, they would follow the Secretary of the Interior standards, and they detailed what was expected of a professionally prepared work plan, showing the existing conditions, proposed work time frame, etc., which would have led to a spreadsheet more or less like what you saw from John before. They also wanted annual reports describing work completed, and at the time we're proposing monitoring by city staff every 2 years. And when staff went to try to get these changes in the program agendized, they returned with a request from the city manager that an annual cap on total lost revenue attributed to new contracts be imposed, as well as a cap on the value of any individual new contract. Now, both the Conservancy, which I represent, and the Landmarks Commission were very concerned about this proposal. We consider the Mills Act Santa Monica's only financial incentive for preservation. It's certainly the most significant. And when we were finally able to gather the data, which was surprisingly difficult, we determined that the program currently costs the city less than 3% of its total property tax receipts, which was considered to be a very low level of investment considering the benefits to the city in restoration of it, at that point, 57 designated properties. There's really been no evidence of a rush to apply for the Mills Act or to have properties designated to achieve Mills Act contracts. We have about 10% of total properties in the city eligible for designation, but the application rate for contracts has been typically 5 or fewer per year. I think we've had a couple of years when there were 10 and a couple of years when there were none. We felt strongly that the proposed caps create a disincentive to designate, in part because a cap on the total would create uncertainty for any given property owner who we were asking to make a significant investment in developing the application without having any idea what other applications would be made. So it wasn't at all clear whether they might not be crowded out from getting a contract for at least a year by an influx of designations from other property owners. And we were also very concerned about proposing a limitation on the value of a contract without a process for exemption or some kind of consideration. We hear again and again about extremely valuable properties in Santa Monica that were purchased in very poor condition. And so if there isn't the incentive of the Mills Act available, the probability of loss of the property becomes very high. Now, as of a month ago, the Commission was told that the proposal for caps will be dropped and that the proposal for improvement of the process will go to the City Council without the staff recommendation of caps. We're a bit nervous about it yet because we feel that once the conversation has been started, certain council members are likely to pick it up whether or not it comes from a recommendation from the city manager, and we're kind of waiting with bated breath to see all of this goes through. In our view, our program is underutilized in the city. We feel we have despite the recent A+ that we got from the LA Conservancy on our preservation program, we feel that there are a lot of areas where the implementation has been wanting, and that in general the public doesn't really understand the benefits of preservation, both to property owners and to the community as a whole. And we have one more slide, which is kind of, I think, an interesting transition to Patricia's discussion. This is a recently granted contract to a landmark called the Brecht House. It was the home of Bertolt Brecht for most of his time in the U.S. after he fled from Europe. He's well known as a poet, playwright, etc. The home was landmarked in 2011 when it had been put up for sale by the estate of the previous owners. And at first there was a lot of fear in the real estate community about selling this landmark property. And it was purchased by a family whose plans for it were written up in the LA Times a couple of weeks ago, which is where these photos come from, who made it was fortunately a very large lot. They made a large contemporary addition with, if you can look in the upper right-hand corner, a transparent glass bridge that connects the new addition, which you don't see, I mean, you barely see from the street because it's so plain. It looks like it might be a wall or something with the rest of the house. And eventually it will be covered with with vines so that it will even more appear to be part of the landscape. But below you can see the photo from the rear, which shows the addition. And the Santa Monica Conservancy granted this project a preservation award in 2014.
Thank you, Carol. And that is a great transition because, Patricia, I hope that you'll address some of our questions about new additions and how they're valued. But I think it was particularly good to see that example for everyone to see.
Yes.
Patricia?
Yes. I'm Patricia Connor, and I am responsible for approximately 500 MILSAC contracts that I review annually between the City of West Hollywood and the City of Los Angeles. Been doing this for quite a bit of time, about 10 years now, so I'm pretty familiar with the mechanics of the calculations. I review them each year. The tax savings, as you can see from the slide, allows qualifying owners to receive a pretty big tax reduction, and the savings are used to rehabilitate, restore, and maintain their properties. I have properties that have owners that have purchased the property, quite a bit of time ago, maybe in the 80s, 90s. Older properties that, not older properties, but the properties that have been possessed for a long time by the owners usually don't benefit as much as newer owners of the properties. The MILSAC contract is especially beneficial to people who have just recently purchased their property at high market values, and they also are pumping a lot of money in to rehabilitate the properties once they've bought it, so they have a major investment into their dwelling. I am required annually to review the property, so I look at the MILSAC contracts each and every year, and I value them by 3 different methods. The first is the Prop 13, which is the purchase price with a maximum increase each year of 2%. And the second valuation I look at is the market approach. I gather comparables just like somebody would do if they were doing an appraiser type analysis or a broker putting a property on the market. I use non-Mills Act properties to base my market valuation. Usually, a Mills Act property usually receives a higher purchase price in the marketplace because the owner knows that there's going to be a tax reduction. So we don't use Mills Act parcels for our valuation comparison in the market approach. The last approach I use is the income approach, and this is usually the most advantageous for Mills Act properties. I look at all sources of income, which here in LA, we have a lot of rents from commercials and movies and televisions, etc. I also have some properties that also have oil rights. I think that's a current source of controversy in LA City Council, if they're going to continue to include that. Also, washing revenue in commercial properties and mixed-use properties, family, large dwellings, apartment houses, etc. And there's some properties I have that also collect parking fees. So all that gets included into the total amount of income. The income is then given a 5% vacancy and collection loss. And then I also take off the expenses. And expenses are everything except mortgage expense and property taxes. So we don't include any financing at all in our deductions.
Yeah,
So
Patricia,
Patricia,
this is John. I just wanted to chime in here and ask if you could move your phone closer or increase your voice level. I'm getting a few comments that the audio is low.
Okay. Okay. Just to recap, all the sources of income are looked at, 5% vacancy and collection loss, and then we take off all the expenses. I just actually mailed out this week 500 requests to all my property owners for their expense sheets for last year, telling me what they did to their property. I do go out and make inspections inside and out to take a look at those expenses, and I come up with a basic profit and loss statement. I look at the net income, and then I divide that net income by the current cap rate, and that gives me a value. So then I look at the Prop 13, I look at the market, and I look at the income approach, and whatever is the lowest is the valuation that property gets for the year for their Mills Act valuation. And a lot of you probably are wondering what makes up the cap rate. It's several percentages that are added together. The first is the SBE interest component, and that is given to us every year by the State Board of Equalization, and it's tied to the average of the national mortgage rate because mortgages have been dropping down so much. The rate last year was 3.75. This year it's going to 4%. And if net income stays the same each year, but the cap rate drops down, which it has been, then the valuation goes up. If the cap rate goes up and that net income stays the same, then the valuation goes down. So we're going to have a little drop this year in 2014 for the valuations if everything stays the same because the cap rate has gone up slightly. We then add in the risk component. The risk component for owner-occupied single-family residence or condominium is 4%. And if that single-family residence or condominium is rented out, or it's mixed-use, commercial, or multifamily, it gets 2% that's added on to the SBE interest rate. And then the improvement to base value ratio times building amortization component, that is at the discretion of the assessor. We look at the total valuation of the property and what we think is appropriate for the improvement allocation, contribution to the total valuation, and the land is also looked at. So it might be a 60-40, 60% improvement, 40% land. In some cases, that might be an adjustment there. And then we add in the tax rate component. So all of those give us the total cap rate. We divide that cap rate into the net income, and that gives us the value. We do look at this each and every year. One of the things to talk about also is that the assessment that I look at is done during the springtime, summertime. The bills are usually mailed out by the tax collector in the fall, the end of September, beginning of October, and the first valuation from going back to the lien date of January 1st is reflected in the December 10th installment, with the second installment due the next April. And there are no retroactive provisions. So if I receive a contract from Lambert this year for 2013, I'm going to value it at January 1st, 2014, and that tax saving would show up in the December 10th bill that's being sent out at the end of the year. Also, to address a lot of questions that I heard, and to also kind of follow up on this beautiful property in Santa Monica, we do look at new construction, and we add on new construction to the existing Mills Act valuation. In this particular property, we valued the existing residence according to our Mills Act process here, and then we added the new construction costs for the addition, the two-story addition, to the property. One of the interesting things here about this property is the original residence had its kitchen removed, so it basically is a guest house, and then the kitchen was put into the new addition. So what we did here at the assessor's office is we removed the construction cost for the new construction in that new addition and just valued the new addition without that kitchen, and then blended those two values together, and that's what the property owner will be receiving for their valuation for 2014.
Thank you, Patricia. Moving on to Shannon Lochner from the Office of Historic Preservation. And Shannon, I'm hoping that you'll address OHP's changed role after 2012.
I certainly will, and I'll try to keep it very short because I know we want to get to the question and the answer. But as Robert mentioned, I'm the Mills Act coordinator here at OHP, and the quirky thing about being the Mills Act coordinator is that we really don't have an active role in the program. Prior to the 2012 changes, there was some language in the legislation that said the Department of Parks and Recreation had the right or the ability to carry out inspections, and then also there was a requirement for property owners to submit their contract to us. But one of the things that ended up happening is because of the fact that we had no way of knowing when a local government was entering into a contract with a property owner, we had no way of enforcing that we were actually receiving those contracts. So that data was never kept. And we were never really able to utilize it. So then when the word was out that Assemblyman Hueso at the time was interested in amending the legislation, we actually worked with the Parks legislative staff to get that language removed since we weren't able to use it, and kind of had the onerous then put on the local governments to make sure that the contract was actually recorded. And at the same time, the language about us being able, or the Department of Parks and Recreation, being able to go out and do inspections was removed, and again, that requirement was put on the local government. So at this time, if you actually look at the legislation, which is California Government Code 5280 to 5290, the very last portion says that the California State Historical Resources Commission serves as a technical assistance, or a body for technical assistance. And so us acting as staff to the commission really are here to kind of provide that technical assistance both to local governments and to property owners. And really, honestly, we see our biggest role, my supervisor, Lucinda Woodward, who happens to be in the room with me right now, calls us the matchmakers. Our job, or our ability, is to put both property owners that are seeking information about programs in touch with the appropriate local government, or local governments that are having similar issues in touch with one another. Because we sit here and we field phone calls from communities and from property owners, but those connections aren't always being made, and so we do have kind of that statewide perspective and the ability to kind of help the appropriate people link up and communicate. So we're here kind of as the program cheerleaders. I think one of the things that I really want to reinforce is that we view this as a critical incentive because of the fact that at this time it's the only preservation incentive that is available to single-family properties. And it's really wonderful to hear things like in the city of Los Angeles, 75% of their over 700 contracts are for single-family residents. And same in the city of Orange. It's really remarkable, and we love to hear that. So I apologize. I didn't actually get the opportunity to prepare a PowerPoint because I didn't think that I was going to have time to speak. So I'm happy to have been able to present that little bit of information.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shannon. And I hope people now know that we will field questions. And we have one question that's been sitting here for a while, and it's about multifamily residential buildings. I think we're talking about the concept where there is a condominium that operates in a multifamily building, and I know several cities like West Hollywood have entered into separate agreements with a few property owners in a multifamily building, and the City of Los Angeles has adopted a special form for the Homeowners Association to enter into agreements. So I'm kind of hoping that Lambert might be able to address the special form that the City of Los Angeles uses, and Patricia might be able to address at least West Hollywood's program. And if anyone is on the phone from West Hollywood, it would be great if you spoke up. Lambert?
Yes, I'll jump in. I mean, we had this issue come up, I think it was 2008. We had our first HOA condominium association property, which is also a designated historic cultural monument, the Biscuit Company building in downtown, approach us with the concept of how to look at applying the Mills Act to the HOA condo association. So we worked with our city attorney and looked at, taking our standard single owner contract form, how would that modify to address a common ownership interest. And so what we came up with was not so much a form, but really a process. And it looks at, first of all, the contract residing with the association, but referencing all of the properties that are part of the condominium association. And that was really seen kind of first and foremost as a requirement to deal with the HOA as opposed to having contracts among individual unit owners, primarily due to enforcement, that in most cases the common areas of the building are in fact the elements that represent the historic components of the building that an individual owner wouldn't necessarily have any control over, that in most cases an individual unit owner owns from a paint line to a paint line and doesn't actually own the common elements of the building or have any control over those. So that was kind of first and foremost. I know that Long Beach had done things a little bit differently prior to that, and when it came time to enforcement, they had some issues because they couldn't actually enforce the contract since it wasn't against the HOA. So what we've done subsequent, I think we probably have maybe a half a dozen condo HOA contracts, but because of how bylaws are written and the right of the HOA to inspect individual units, what we've often done is have attorneys representing the HOAs take our standard contract and modify it to reflect some of the requirements that their HOA has, and then we have the applicant prepare that as a draft, which goes to our city attorney so they can review it for legality and content. So that's kind of the approach we've taken, and Patricia may have some other thoughts relative to contracts that she's seen that represent condos.
Well, in the city of West Hollywood, I have two properties in particular. One is the Granville, and then the next street over is the Colonial. The Colonial now, in its entirety, is Mills Acted. The Granville, probably I have 35% or Mills Act, and each owner must apply individually to the city of West Hollywood, and then that contract is put into place. And it's a little bit different than the city of Los Angeles, where, Lambert, you write them through the Homeowners Association. I can't really give you any more information than that, just from working the Mills Act and observing the two different cities on how they work.
And I suspect we would encourage the Homeowners Association, for all the reasons that Lambert outlined, especially with the common area, to enter into the contract in a more comprehensive manner. I'm going to jump around to take the questions, if you don't mind. There's a question about the initial 10-year period and our experience in requesting a new scope of work. I know For the City of Los Angeles, it's often the case that there's a revised scope of work in the period of 5 to 10 years. There's often interesting and different challenges on properties, and I don't know if Marissa or John or Susan might be able to address this and what you've seen in changes over time.
Sure, I can jump in. In orange, the city requires the property owner to submit a revised scope of work in essentially the 9th year of the contract, so prior to the next 10-year contract term for another 10 years of the contract.
John or Susan, anything else?
For San Clemente, we do not have anything for the next 10 years established at this time.
Could you repeat the question again, Robert?
The question was about preparing a new scope of work after the initial 10-year period, or when you might entertain receiving a new scope of work from a property owner.
This time we haven't had that come up. We tried to have everyone include their potential rehabilitation projects, even as far out as 20 years or 30 years into the contract, if they would like to obligate themselves or future homeowners to that. But we haven't had anyone come back to us and try to include something else into the contract after it was recorded.
Lambert, maybe this is an opportunity to comment a bit about notices of cancellation for breach of the contract and kind of how you've handled those, and I'm curious to know if others on the phone have had similar situations.
Right. I mean, it's a good point. We've had 2 properties that kind of got to the point of the city kind of threatening to cancel the contract, and in both cases, the properties have been completely turned around and were brought back from the brink of cancellation. Cancellation, of course, being the major stick that the Mills Act has with the 12.5% of current fair market value penalty. So in most cases, that's a huge number that a property owner would just as soon avoid. The money, in fact, if a property got to that point where the city canceled the contract, the county auditor, I believe, collects the money or puts it as a lien against the property, and then when that is repaid, monies are redistributed to agencies that lost revenue under that contract. But so we've only had a couple that even got close to the brink of disaster, but were pulled back by actions of the property owners. But in terms of notices of non-renewal, we have one that was submitted essentially on a property owner who, when they applied, they kind of didn't really look realistically at their income numbers, and so they didn't get any benefit under the contract. So they submitted a notice of non-renewal to essentially sunset the contract. But in most cases, property owners really want to stay in the program, assuming that they're receiving benefit, or they see it as a long-term, benefit to the property, that should the property change hands, that the incentive would carry forward and be an incentive to a buyer. So we haven't had too many examples of notices of non-renewal.
Well, and I think that the notion of issuing a notice of non-renewal at the same time as you enter the contract is something akin to a revolving fund that would allow new contracts to come forward. And this is another question that's coming up. Does anyone know of a city, we thought it was San Clemente, it might be Berkeley, that issues a notice of non-renewal when they enter into a contract, so the contract doesn't renew every year for an additional 10 years. It's only a 10-year contract. Does anyone have any experience with that? Shannon, maybe you know about this?
Yeah, I was actually just about to jump in, and honestly, the first that I had heard about that was when we did our walkthrough for the webinar, so I am not aware of a local government that simultaneously enters into a contract and then issues a non-renewal.
And I guess probably the last question was one of the first, which has to do with the staff time that it takes to do an inspection, and it was addressed to John, and maybe Lambert could address how what the cost of an inspection you think might be in terms of budgeting. John first.
With San Clemente, there's no cost associated with the inspections. In most cases, because all of our rehabilitation improvements identified in the contract are exterior improvements, they are required to go through planning, and so we do work with them early on. So we are able to kind of coordinate with them early on to get the inspection done. Really depends, but for a year, maybe less than 10% of my time is designated towards the actual inspections. Probably a total of 10% for the inspections and the management. Also, just with our limited staff here, try to utilize interns in helping us get out those annual letters, updating the spreadsheet, more simple tasks associated with that.
And Lambert, maybe you could address that as well.
Well, I mean, what we've budgeted for, since we actually haven't been doing ongoing inspections for some time, what we look at relative to new contracts, new applications, and what we budget for in those inspections, we're looking at typically for an average single-family property between about $500 and $750. That's about what it takes to do the inspections on those properties. So as we look ahead to charging a contract maintenance fee, looking at a kind of annual cost, again, for a typical single-family property, it'll be somewhere between $100 and maybe $140 a year. So we're hoping that that's still a relatively accessible amount that people won't see as a disincentive. For commercial properties, we'll have to look, relative to, what the commensurate amount will be for that. But again, trying to keep it relatively reasonable as an annual kind of amount.
Thank you. We did remarkably well on time, and I appreciate everyone's participation today. I know, Jonathan, you have some house cleaning and a survey.
Right. Yeah. No, I wanted to close this off just by giving everybody a quick, or encouraging everybody, please, to fill out the survey and type in your typed response on the right, in the boxes on the right-hand side, so that we can improve our programs. One thing about the survey is you'll notice on the top of the page is a Submit Response button. Unfortunately, we couldn't put it on the bottom of the page, so what you'll have to do is fill out your responses. These are multiple choice questions. Complete the survey, and then scroll back up to the top of the page and click on the Submit Response button. So I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. I wanted to thank our 9 wonderful speakers. I think it was a very well-run session, and everybody was able to cover a different aspect of the Mills Act. I wanted to also encourage everybody to join our next webinar, which is on the 8th of April, and it's on economic development. This is part of a 3-part series, and this would be part 1. The title of this part is Vibrant Main Streets and Downtown Development. It will be presented by Doug Loescher. It'll be held again on the 8th of April from noon to 1:30. And so, again, wanted to thank everybody, and if you would like to if you'd like to receive a discount on this 3-part series, please contact CPS, and we're happy to arrange that. At the top of the page is a list of links to our upcoming events, as well as some resources related to today's session. And I wanted to thank everybody for supporting CPS, and have a wonderful day.